这一位John 叫做 Gerzema， 他出了一本书叫做 Brand Bubble， 就是品牌的泡沫。品牌泡沫的意思是说，这里有一段很简单的解释，就是说传统上在做生意的人，他们来用了很多年的这个行销跟策略的方法，已经 no longer work， 再也不能够照这样子去做了，因为 consumer behavior 就是消费者的行为已经改变 so rapidly and profoundly， 就是变得很快，而且变得很大，所以它需要一种完全全新的这个视野去做品牌的管理。那这个是各位同学刚刚会从学校几年以后，你们会从学校毕业，你们会碰到这个时代的一个刚刚开始的时候。这个时代刚刚开始，事实上是一个起点，就是说整个品牌的管理跟20世纪是绝对不同的。所以建议各位对这个部分要有一些想法跟看法跟准备啊。那这位先生他也讲了说，一个有能量的品牌要有这5个条件啊。那这5个条件跟大家简单的说明一下，那就是要有动能跟要有方向，就是说这个品牌到底向哪个地方去，它动能够不够？刚刚有一位同学不是在讲无印良品吗？无印良品你感觉它有动能，而且它有方向，它不会出产品是一下出这样一下出这样变来变去，它就是做那样的东西，而且它非常有能量。什么叫非常有能量？它在推陈出新，以及它在推出它商品的时候，你觉得它是有韵律的啊，所以这个就是能量跟方向。那 constantly reinvent itself， 就是说不断的去重新发明它自己，也就是不断的把自己的东西一直改善，甚至呢把自己的某一些已经不对的东西抛弃，然后去变成一个新的样貌，这个也是一种有能量的品牌。Engage consumers on its own terms， 就是说你必须要让你在发展产品的时候，必须要让消费者更去融入你的产品。那这个东西不是去跟着消费者的无知去做，消费者有的时候他有他的想法跟观点，可是他在专业上是无知的，所以你必须要让他的想法跟观点可以实现，可是你又必须要站在专业上面去补足他专业的不足。建筑师也是一样，不是业主说什么你就要做什么，但是也不应该去说业主要住的房子你当成自己要住的房子来设计，这是不通的啊。很多的设计师会跟业主吵架，是因为他把业主要住的房子当成自己的房子，那所以设计了半天业主不喜欢。很多的设计师会跟业主吵架，是因为业主说什么他就照做什么，那到最后业主说怎么这么难看，他说是你自己说的，那个时候一定吵架，因为业主为什么要找你？如果他自己就已经会做的话，所以 engage consumers on its own terms, attract without chasing 这一句话是我希望跟各位同学分享，尤其各位到了社会上以后，你有的时候需要去做行销啊等等，你必须要去吸引消费者，但是你不要去追消费者，你必须要让消费者来跟着你，而不是你要跟着消费者去。因为你跟着消费者去，你到最后就变成大家杀价的这种可怜的局面。然后 move culture as well as categories， 就是你要真正重点是要把这个文化去做一个改变。那我想这些东西都是重点。那它这里有一个网站，如果各位是学工业设计，那特别可以去，或者是你对于这个品牌特别有兴趣，你可以去这里看。这个 Young Rubicon 他们的一个品牌研究的工具，你可以从这里看。举例来说，他现在这个叫做 Virgin Atlantic 就是那个叫做什么？有一个头发留长长的那个 Virgin Records 那个老板，这个。知道这个公司的举手，我看知道，你要不要跟大家解释那是叫什么？中文叫什么？围巾啊，对，就是围巾。那你看它的这些数据 ，uniqueness， 这个 appropriate， 这个likability 人家喜欢的程度，然后再加上这个 awareness 大家知不知道他，就是说看各位同学都不太举手，就是大家他知道的人很少，在西方很多，可是他的这个uniqueness 就是他很特别，他是非常特别。那比如说你去看，你说啊，那在 7-Eleven 怎么样呢？你就按 7-Eleven， 你就可以看到 7-Eleven uniqueness 几乎一点都不 unique， 因为它跟大家都一样啊，所以它没有什么好特别的。可是它的这个品牌的这个价值里面是很多人知道它的，就是大家都知道 7-Eleven， 所以你就可以从这里知道这两种品牌的结构，那它掉在什么位置？它掉在什么样子的一个位置，你就可以去做一些了解啊。我们再找一个来，用 Amazon 好了。所以你可以看到，如果你要买股票，你是不是一定买 Amazon？ 它所有东西都这么高，所以这个就是它的品牌价值。OK， 所以那你看它跑到什么位置？跑到这个位置，这个位置呢叫做irresistible， 就是不可抗拒性，所以它已经在这个，你要买一本书，你真的在真的要买一些书的时候，像我自己买书很少到书店去，我都直接在网络上买。如果买西洋的书，我几乎都是在 Amazon 买。那原因就是说，你事实上它的服务好到让你没有办法抗拒，所以这个它掉的位置是在这里。所以他们透过长时间的资料的调查，发展了一种叫 brand asset 那个 variator。去把这个东西做出来，它的品牌的价值如何，它掉在什么样子的位置，我想这个对品牌有兴趣的人都可以去设法理解。好，我们刚刚已经他的这个问答我提前问了，所以各位同学也都讲得很好，我相信对品牌的秩序各位有一些想法了。我们先来看这个人的要讲什么，设计师思想。设计师思想，这个人叫 Tim Brown， 他是一个设计家。他今天我们要拿他来跟我们讲的题目，他在 TED 里面有2场演讲，他的这一场是叫做 Design Thinking， 就是设计的思想。他是谁？他是 IDEO 的 CEO。看一下 Wikipedia 里面对他们的介绍，这家公司非常有意思，所以目前有350位设计师专注于不同的领域，比如说人机界面、这个机台开发、电子、软体设计、工业设计和界面设计，是世界上最活跃的大型设计公司之一。他的人并不是多到那么多，但是他做的很多东西是很重要的。他最著名的作品是苹果电脑和微软的第一个滑鼠，还有这个 PDA 等等。他的这个客户也都是非常著名的客户。原来第一位创办人呢，就是这个人，斯坦福大学的教授，叫做David Kelly。那现在他应该已经退休了，所以由 Tim Brown 来这个接任啊。所以我们回过头来再来看看他说些什么。他要跟我们说的是大设计的思想啊。
I'd like to talk a little bit this morning about what happens if we move from design to design thinking. Now this rather old photo up there is actually the first project I was ever hired to do, something like 25 years ago. It's a woodworking machine, or at least a piece of one, and my task was to make this thing a little bit more modern, a little bit easier to use. I thought at the time I did a pretty good job. Unfortunately, not very long afterwards, the company went out of business. This is the second project that I did. It's a fax machine. I put an attractive shell around some new technology. Again, 18 months later, the product was obsolete. And now, of course, the whole technology is obsolete. Now, I'm a fairly slow learner, but eventually it occurred to me that maybe what passed for design wasn't all that important. Making things more attractive, making them a bit easier to use, making them more marketable. By focusing on a design, maybe just a single product, I was being incremental. and not having much of an impact. But I think this small view of design is a relatively recent phenomena, and in fact really emerged in the latter half of the 20th century as design became a tool of consumerism. So when we talk about design today, and particularly when we read about it in the popular press, we're often talking about products like these. Amusing, yes. Desirable, maybe. Important, not so very. But this wasn't always the way. And I'd like to suggest that if we take a different view of design and focus less on the object and more on design thinking as an approach, that we actually might see the result in a bigger impact. Now, this gentleman, Isambard Kingdom Brunel, designed many great things in his career in the 19th century, including the Clifton Suspension Bridge in Bristol and the Thames Tunnel at Rotherhithe, both great designs and actually very innovative too. His greatest creation runs actually right through here in Oxford. It's called the Great Western Railway. And as a kid, I grew up very close to here, and one of my favorite things to do was to cycle along by the side of the railway waiting for the great big express trains to roar past. You can see it represented here in J.M.W. Turner's painting, Rain, Steam, and Speed. Now, what Brunel said that he wanted to achieve for his passengers was the experience of floating across the countryside. Now, this was back in the 19th century. And to do that meant creating the flattest gradients that ever yet been made, which meant building long viaducts across river valleys. This is actually the viaduct across the Thames at Maidenhead, and long tunnels, such as the one at Box in Wiltshire. But he didn't stop there. He didn't stop with just trying to design the best railway journey. He imagined an integrated transportation system in which it would be possible for a passenger to embark on a train in London and disembark from a ship in New York. One journey from London to New York. This is the SS Great Western that he built to take care of the second half of that journey. Now, Brunel was working 100 years before the emergence of the design profession. But I think he was using design thinking to solve problems and to create world-changing innovations. Now, design thinking begins with what Roger Martin, the business school professor at the University of Toronto, calls integrative thinking. And that's the ability to exploit opposing ideas and opposing constraints to create new solutions. In the case of design, that means balancing desirability, what humans need, with technical feasibility and economic viability. With innovations like the Great Western, we can stretch that balance to the absolute limit. So somehow, we went from this to this. Systems thinkers who were reinventing the world to a priesthood of folks in black turtlenecks and designer glasses working on small things. As our industrial society matured, so design became a profession, and it focused on an ever smaller canvas until it came to stand for aesthetics, image, and fashion. Now, I'm not trying to throw stones here. I'm a fully paid up member of that priesthood, and somewhere in here I have my designer glasses. There we go. But I do think that perhaps design is getting big again, and that's happening through the application of design thinking to new kinds of problems, to global warming, to education, healthcare, security, clean water, whatever. And as we see this reemergence of design thinking and we see it beginning to tackle new kinds of problems, there are some basic ideas that I think we can observe that are useful. And I'd like to talk about some of those just for the next few minutes. The first of those is that design is human-centered. It may integrate technology and economics, but it starts with what humans need or might need. What makes life easier, more enjoyable? What makes technology useful and usable? But that's more than simply good ergonomics, putting the buttons in the right place. It's often about understanding culture and context before we even know where to start to have ideas. So when a team was working on a new vision screening program in India, they wanted to understand what the aspirations and motivations were of these school children to understand how they might play a role in screening their parents. Conversion Sound has developed a high-quality, ultra-low-cost digital hearing aid for the developing world. Now, in the West, we rely on highly trained technicians to fit these hearing aids. In places like India, those technicians simply don't exist. So it took a team working in India with patients and community health workers to understand how a PDA and an application on a PDA might replace those technicians in a fitting and diagnostic service. Instead of starting with technology, the team started with people and culture. So if human need is the place to start, then design thinking rapidly moves on to learning by making. Instead of thinking about what to build, building in order to think. Now, prototypes speed up the process of innovation because it's only when we put our ideas out into the world that we really start to understand their strengths and weaknesses. And the faster we do that, the faster our ideas evolve. Now, much has been said and written about the Aravind Eye Institute in Madurai, India. They do an incredible job of serving very poor patients by taking the revenues from those who can afford to pay to cross-subsidize those who cannot. Now, they are very efficient, but they're also very innovative. When I visited them a few years ago, what really impressed me was their willingness to prototype their ideas very early. This is the manufacturing facility for one of their biggest cost breakthroughs. They make their own intraocular lenses. These are the lenses that replace those that are damaged by cataracts. And I think it's partly their prototyping mentality that really allowed them to achieve the breakthrough, because they brought the cost down from $200 a pair down to just $4 a pair. Partly they did this by, instead of building a fancy new factory, they used the basement of one of their hospitals. And instead of installing the large-scale machines used by Western producers, they used low-cost CAD/CAM prototyping technology. They're now the biggest manufacturer of these lenses in the developing world and have recently moved into a custom factory. So if human need is the place to start and prototyping a vehicle for progress, then there are also some questions to ask about the destination. Instead of seeing its primary objective as consumption, design thinking is beginning to explore the potential of participation. The shift from a passive relationship between consumer and producer to the active engagement of everyone in experiences that are meaningful, productive, and profitable. So I'd like to take the idea that Rory Sutherland talked about, this notion that intangibles, things are worth perhaps more than physical things, and take that a little bit further and say that I think the design of participatory systems in which many more forms of value beyond simply cash are both created and measured is going to be the major theme, not only for design, but also for our economy as we go forward. So William Beveridge, when he wrote the first of his famous reports in 1942, created what became Britain's welfare state, in which he hoped that every citizen would be an active participant in their own social well-being. By the time he wrote his third report, he confessed that he had failed, and instead had created a society of welfare consumers. Hilary Cottam, Charlie Ledbetter, and Hugo Manasai of Participal have taken this idea of participation, and in their manifesto entitled Beveridge 4.0, they are suggesting a framework for reinventing the welfare state. So in one of their projects called Southwark Circle, they worked with residents in Southwark, South London, and a small team of designers to develop a new membership organization to help the elderly with household tasks. Designs were refined and developed with 150 older people and their families before the service was launched earlier this year. We can take this idea of participation perhaps to its logical conclusion and say that design may have its greatest impact when it's taken out of the hands of designers and put into the hands of everyone. Nurses and practitioners at US healthcare system Kaiser Permanente studied the topic of improving the patient experience, and particularly focused on the way that they exchange knowledge and change shift. Through a program of observational research, brainstorming new solutions, and rapid prototyping, they developed a completely new way to change shift. They went from retreating to the nurse's station to discuss the various states and needs of patients to developing a system that happened on the ward in front of patients using a simple software tool. By doing this, they brought the time that they were away from patients down from 40 minutes to 12 minutes on average. They increased patient confidence and nurse happiness. When you multiply that by all the nurses on all the wards in 40 hospitals in the system, it resulted actually in a pretty big impact. And this is just one of thousands of opportunities in healthcare alone. So these are just some of the kind of basic ideas around design thinking and some of the kinds of new kinds of projects that they're being applied to. But I'd like to go back to Brunel here and suggest a connection that might explain why this is happening now, and maybe why design thinking is a useful tool. And that connection is change. In times of change, we need new alternatives, new ideas. Now, Brunel worked at the height of the Industrial Revolution when all of life and our economy was being reinvented. Now, the industrial systems of Brunel's time have run their course, and indeed, they're part of the problem today. But again, we're in the midst of massive change. And that change is forcing us to question quite fundamental aspects of our society: how we keep ourselves healthy, how we govern ourselves, how we educate ourselves, how we keep ourselves secure. And in these times of change, we need these new choices because our existing solutions are simply becoming obsolete. So why design thinking? Because it gives us a new way of tackling problems. Instead of defaulting to our normal convergent approach, where we make the best choice out of available alternatives, it encourages us to take a divergent approach, to explore new alternatives, new solutions, new ideas that have not existed before. But before we go through that process of divergence, there's actually quite an important first step. And that's, what is the question that we're trying to answer? What's the design brief? Now, Brunel may have asked a question like this: how do I take a train from London to New York? But what are the kinds of questions that we might ask today? So these are some that we've been asked to think about recently. And one in particular is one that we're working on with the Acumen Fund in a project that's been funded by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. How might we improve access to safe drinking water for the world's poorest people, and at the same time stimulate innovation amongst local water providers? So instead of having a bunch of American designers come up with new ideas that may or may not have been appropriate, we took a sort of a more open, collaborative, and participative approach. We teamed designers and investment experts up with 11 water organizations across India. And through workshops, they developed innovative new products, services, and business models. We hosted a competition and then funded 5 of those organizations to develop their ideas. So they developed and iterated these ideas, and then IDEO and Acumen spent several weeks working with them to help design new social marketing campaigns, community outreach strategies, business models, new water vessels for storing water, and carts for delivering water. Some of those ideas are just getting launched into the market, and the same process is just getting underway with NGOs in East Africa. So for me, this project shows kind of how far we can go from some of those sort of small things that I was working on at the beginning of my career. That by focusing on the needs of humans, by using prototypes to move ideas along quickly, by getting the process out of the hands of designers, and getting the active participation of the community, we can tackle bigger and more interesting questions. And just like Brunel, by focusing on systems, we can have a bigger impact. So that's one thing that we've been working on. I'd actually be quite interested, and perhaps more interested, to know what this community thinks we could work on. What kinds of questions do we think design thinking could be used to tackle? And if you've got any ideas, then feel free. You can post them to Twitter. There's a hashtag there that you can use, CBDQ. And the list looked something like this a little while ago. And of course, you can search to find the questions that you're interested in by using the same hash code. So, I'd like to believe that design thinking actually can make a difference, that it can help create new ideas and new innovations beyond the latest high street products. To do that, I think we have to take a more expansive view of design, more like Brunel, less a domain of a professional priesthood. And the first step is to start asking the right questions. Thank you very much.
他刚刚说的最后一句话，我想对各位同学会非常有用。学习开始问对的问题啊，因为要去问一个问题，可能也比要去答一个问题来得困难，所以我们开始学着去把问题问对。那问题问对，是因为你一直在做一些思考。那这个为什么我想他刚刚说的这个事情重要呢？在各位休息的时候，请大家思考几个事情，等一下我们来做探讨。第一个呢，他认为他在开始做设计的时候，他是在做很好的设计，但是很小的设计。所谓很好而很小的设计，就是说那些设计并没有重要到那个程度。一个木工的机台，也许他把它设计得很漂亮，那个公司一下就倒了。一个传真机，他把它的这个设计得很好用，可是过了一阵子，这个传真机也过时了。所以他觉得这些都是影响不大而不重要的东西。那变成设计变成是一个消费主义的工具，所以他说它是一个 tool of 这个 consumerism， 就是消费主义的工具。他认为设计不应该变成消费主义的工具，它应该变成是一个更具有思想的一个大系统。所以比如说他很钦佩的那位英国19世纪的一位思考的人，他做了这个铁路系统，他甚至把铁路想象到说，如果客人从我这里上车，他能不能一上车就到达纽约去？那纽约的后半段它是变成海，所以他思想整个系统。那这种系统对于这个事情的解决才会大。那另外呢，我想他谈到的一个东西是重点，我也给各位做一点点提示。他谈到的对那个设计铁路的人，他有一个梦想，那个梦想就是要让人家坐火车的时候觉得好像飘在平原上面，从平原上面飘过。在19世纪，而不是像现在我们有高铁可以坐，你要用很快的速度上从平原飘过，你的技术要先把这个铁道做得非常的平。那这个对他来讲是一个挑战啊。那另外呢，就是说设计的专业要能够处理矛盾。如果你要处理矛盾，你就是要能够处理这个需求可行性，还有它能不能这个生存下去，这些都是系统思考需要去做的事情。那么他另外谈到的一个重点就是说，设计永远要从人开始，而不要从技术开始，更不要从某一种材料去开始。所以我把它归结为他讲的就是说，如果我们要把设计做成有影响力，我们不要谈技术，不是只谈美感，而是谈人类因为文化而来的需求，我们如何去解决。像刚刚举的例子，在印度没有这个技师，所以他怎么样去帮这些人配这些助听器？那么那个就是设计一个系统。在东非没有好的这个自来水厂，所以他怎么样为这些人去做设计？那他谈到的另外一个观念是 prototype， 怎么样子从这个为什么要做一个 prototype？ 就像建筑也好，我想很多的这个同学都有做过模型。为什么我们要很快的做出一个模型？因为看到模型我们才能够思考，而不是只在图板上画。因为你看到模型的时候，你看到的不只是一个模型，而是你看到很多人跟这个东西变成立体的时候，它运作的关系哈。所以因为印度的那一家这个做眼科的那个做白内障的这个 这个水晶球体的那一家，他用很快的速度去做这个 prototype， 所以他们的成本才能够从200块降到4块钱。所以他特别提到，专业习惯跟专业思想是不同的。专业的习惯就是说，做这种东西就是要这种仪器，做这种东西就是要这种价钱，所以有一个专业上面的习惯。他认为要打破专业习惯，从专业的思想去出发，才会有一个新的结果。那最后更重要的是，他认为要把这个 consumer 跟 producer 变成是同一个，这是在我们上学期已经说过的，就是说，这个 producer consumer 就是我消费者，同时也是一个制造者，也就是一个参与的设计制造系统。参与的设计制造系统是很重要的。我在这里最后提一个问题，就是他说设计也许要不只靠设计师才会有力量。那我的问题是说，如果是这样是对的话，那我们上一堂课就是上一次的那个课程第3堂的时候，那个报纸的设计师，他靠那个设计师为什么会那么成功？就是说他靠了设计，报纸变成很好卖，跟现在他说设计不应该不只靠设计师，应该靠更多人的参与，那它才会变成是一个更好的结果。那么我们就把这个当成思考，大家休息一下，回来以后我们来谈论这个问题。